So we are delighted to host the next in our webinar series on monastic land stewardship, caring for our earth in troubled times. And it's wonderful to have Douglas Christie with us here today. He's a scholar of monasticism with a special emphasis on the intersection of contemplation and the natural world. And I will let him continue to introduce himself and get us started on today's session. Thank you so much, Douglas.
Thank you, Teresa. I appreciate it. Is my sound coming through okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that. And it's wonderful to be with you. I've known Jason through his work and from having met him on a couple of occasions at meetings for the last several years, and admire very much not only his work, but what he's put together here in this webinar. I have not been able to make some of the earlier sessions. I was with you the last time, and I apologize for that. It's just how life worked out. But I'm delighted to be here today, and maybe I should just say a little something about the context for what I'm going to offer today. And so somebody's in the waiting room. Yes. Good old Zoom. So I grew up Catholic. I, like many people, perhaps found myself unable to stay connected with my own faith tradition and kind of drifted away, not from faith, but from a certain strong connection to my Catholic faith. And I sojourned for a time with evangelical Christians who helped me a lot to reclaim something that evangelicals at their best are very, very good at, a sense of personal relationship with the divine. And that helped me return to my Catholic faith in that kind of indirect way, with new feeling and new appreciation. And yet I don't think I would have made my way back to my Catholic faith had it not been for the monastic tradition. And perhaps like some people in this meeting, you try to piece together the patterns of your own story, and it's mysterious, and you can't necessarily altogether understand how you got somewhere. But I was a undergraduate at University of California at Santa Cruz, and I was hungry to go deeper in my own faith life, and someone put me in the company of Thomas Merton, and I began reading, and that reading, as sometimes reading can do, takes you on a journey of an unexpected character, and I found myself reading my way back into the tradition, reading Teresa of Avila, reading Augustine, discovering the ancient Christian monastic tradition of the desert. And this was all sort of mind-blowing to me at the time. And I will sometimes have young people who I have been teaching in recent years, who grew up Catholic, say to me something that I said to myself at the time. I had no idea all this was there. And this is something perhaps worth reflecting on in itself. How is it that we have this incredibly rich contemplative tradition, and so often it's unknown to people? I think maybe it's part of the work of this webinar to kind of unearth that a little bit. Anyway, I eventually, in my early 20s, I visited Our Lady of New Clairvaux in Vina, in this Central Valley of Northern California, amongst the walnut and prune orchards of that monastic place. I hitchhiked up the coast sometime later and made my way to Redwoods Monastery, both Cistercian communities. The sisters at Redwoods came from Belgium originally, but in these places, which turned out to be just the beginning of a much, much longer engagement with monasticism, I found myself so moved by the intuitive sense that here in these places, spiritual practice, especially silence, stillness, openness, was deeply connected to place and to the places where these men and women had committed themselves to live. And I don't think I had language for it at the time. I didn't really know the language of the Benedictine tradition of stabilitas or conversatio morum. I didn't have that in my vocabulary, but I could feel that somehow prayer was rooted to place for these communities. And this was something very powerful in my experience. And if any of you have had the chance to visit Redwoods Monastery, for example, and this is not unique to Redwoods, but it's a good example of it. When they built their chapel, it's a very simple cinder block chapel in the heart of the redwood forest, about 5 hours north of San Francisco. They designed it in a way that made it very difficult to keep outside and inside separate. So it's a very simple chapel, cinder block walls, poured concrete floor, very simple altar. And then behind the altar is a very large, maybe 20-foot high series of glass panels that stand behind the altar. And behind the altar is an enormous redwood tree branching up into four separate trunks and disappearing into the heights. And beyond the redwood tree is a little meadow. And beyond the meadow is the forest. And in the forest is Thompson Creek, which runs to the ocean. And to pray in that space, I began to notice, yes, sometimes I was distracted by looking out the window. Or was I distracted? Is that distraction, or is that another way of being drawn deeper? I've never been able to quite answer that satisfactorily. But whether in the chanting of the Psalms and the rhythm of the monastic office or during Eucharist, outside and inside are dancing together in a way that feels completely right and harmonious. And yes, the chapel has its own integrity as a sacred space, but it's not separate from the meadow and the forest and the river. It's very beautiful, and I I carry that image with me. I was just there this earlier this week. I spent some time at the monastery. They're some of my dearest friends in the world, and there it was again, that deep integrity of place. So that experience as a young person, what I sometimes refer to as the days of my wild youth, uh, it marked me deeply, and it set me on a path that I'm still on now. And my vocation has not been to follow a monastic path. I felt at one point in my 20s, when I began to recognize that that was not my vocation, that this was, I felt this is a deep disappointment, that something that was very precious to me was not any longer going to be available to me. And as is often the case with the learning that we do in our lives, I hadn't quite made my way around to the realization that even though I was not called to be a monastic, I very much was called to be a contemplative, and I began to slowly come home to that in a way that allowed me to draw from monastic traditions and befriend monks and be mentored by them, but live out my own contemplative vocation in a different form, with family and children and work and so forth. And maybe one last thing I'll say, just I know this is a long introduction, but it's kind of maybe trying to give a little context for things. Um, After many years of thinking about these questions, I I began to really hunger for a deeper integration of the natural world in my faith journey, and the natural world, my own embodied existence. And I just began to feel the contemplative and the ecological starting to be drawn together in my own experience, in my consciousness. And again, I didn't have language for this, but I did start to notice that some of the reading and thinking I was doing in the natural history tradition included an extraordinary attention to place, a kind of an uncanny commitment to paying attention. And these things I began to notice were not unlike what I found in the monastic traditions. And so I found myself kind of uh, thinking about them in relation to one another more and more. And the idea of contemplative ecology began to grow in my thought and imagination. And I began to notice that that was a good way to describe often what monks are about in their contemplative life. Their contemplative practice has an ecological character to it. And I don't only mean in the sense of an environmental commitment, although it can also include that. I meant in the sense of a holism, of vision that's inclusive of everything. And then in the natural history tradition, you know, in the American tradition anyway, going back to Emerson and Thoreau, but continuing on up to our present time with many amazing writers, women and men, um, realizing that there's this almost monastic commitment to see, to pay attention, to notice, to not be careless about experience in the world. And I felt like these writers were becoming my teachers in contemplation. And I found that very moving and beautiful. And so all of this is to say that the path that led me toward a kind of an understanding of what we might call contemplative ecology began a long time ago with a hunger to go deeper in my own life. And then it opened up and opened up to become much more inclusive of the wider world than I imagined it would be when I set out. Um, this morning, I'd like to share some images and some ideas with you around the idea of placemaking, or uh, topos, or some people call it topophilia. And I'm hoping that this reflection can contribute to the ongoing work of this little community in this webinar. And it reflects, I guess, if I were to express it in the best way that I think I can, that um, amidst all the work that we're called to do and all the urgent concerns of this moment, of which there are many in relation to the natural world, one that's often hidden from view and that I think does have tremendous value is simply the work of rehabilitating our capacity to see and to inhabit the world. Sometimes in reflecting on this, it feels like, oh gosh, that's a deeply personal work. And what does that have to do with the larger environmental crisis we're facing? I can't pretend that I have a simple answer to that, except that um, I feel uh, convinced that without our own reconversion to the natural world, our own commitments will lack a certain staying power or a certain depth of feeling. And it's also something that we can do in community. We can share our stories. We can share stories of the places that we're from, what those places mean to us, the character of those places. Um, and in doing so, I think encourage one another in the work. This is my own sense. And when we dialogue it a little bit, you'll be able to tell me whether you agree with this or not. But so I'm going to share something here, which um, I hope will come through. And please tell me if this is visible to everyone. Is that okay? Okay. All right. And it's 10:15, and we're meeting for an hour and a half. Is that correct? More or less? Okay. So I'll try to talk for maybe or share some of these ideas for 20, 30 minutes or something, and then we'll see where we are. And of course, part of the reason everyone's here, I think, is to engage in conversation. So I hope that will be, that will unfold naturally. Um, so just, I will comment on the images sometimes. Sometimes I'll let them speak for themselves. This happens to be an image from the Altiplano in Argentina, a place where I lived for 2 years, from 2013 2015. It had its own impact on my imagination and feeling, but that's where we are in this image. And topos is one of the Greek words for place. Kora is also another word. We can, people use those in different ways, but and I'm paraphrasing an idea from the anthropologist Keith Basso in using the idea of placemaking, and it very self-consciously asks about not just place as a location on a map or some place where we happen to be living at a given moment, our place on the earth, but an active engagement, an imaginative work that we participate in when we engage in the work of placemaking, that we ourselves are helping kind of with the unfolding work of discovering what a place is, what it can mean, and helping shape it with our own imaginations. So the art of placemaking is what I want to reflect with you about this morning. Let's just start with this poem by Denise Levertov. And I think it's true that for most of us, many of us, probably for all of us, there are moments in our lives that stand out where we felt moved by something. Sometimes they happen in place. They're shaped by a particular geography. Not always. They can also be moments of just interpersonal connection and intimacy. But this is an example, I think, that might help us get attuned to these questions about what what can sometimes happen to us when we open ourselves to the natural world. I really admire the work of Denise Levertov. She's a person who traveled her own very unexpected path from England, coming to the US, being part of the Black Mountain Poets, not being a religious person at all, although she grew up in a household where religion had some importance. Late in her life, moving to the Pacific Northwest, if you know her work, you'll know that the last couple of collections of her poems feature the feeling of astonishment at what it was like to land in that landscape and to be immersed in it, and it's quite beautiful. But she also she converted to Catholicism fairly late in her life through the witness of the martyrs of El Salvador. This was something that uh, touched her deeply, and she felt compelled to respond to it. So she came into her own sense of faith through a very circuitous journey that also came to include a commitment to justice and the natural world. That day, across a lake in Switzerland 50 years ago, light was jousting with long lances, fencing with broadswords, back and forth among cloudy peaks and foothills. We watched from a small pavilion, my mother and I, enthralled. And then, behold, a shaft, a column, a defined body, not of light, but of silver rain, formed and set out from the distant shore, leaving behind the silent feints and thrusts, and advanced unswervingly at a steady pace toward us. I knew this. I'd seen it, not the sensation of deja vu. It was Blake's ink-wash vision, the Spirit of God moving upon the face of the waters. The column steadily came on across the lake toward us. On each side of it, there was no rain. We rose to our feet, breathless, and then it reached us, took us into its veil of silver, wrapped us in finest weave of wet, and we laughed for joy, astonished. Perhaps you recognize this in some related experience of your own, a moment that left you astonished, a little bit, maybe less guarded than you were before, feeling part of things. Poets help us remember the significance of such seemingly small moments. And I love this poem for that reminder. Oh, I'm trying to move this. Just give me a second. There we go. So I think our work with place, um, anywhere we are in the world, has to return sooner is better than later to indigenous voices, to the voices of those who were here in these places uh, originally. And every place in the world has a story of the colonial catastrophes that drove people from their places, sometimes almost to the point of annihilation or past that point. And this is part of our work of reparation in this time as well, is to listen and to respond to the way that the first peoples saw these places, lived in them, the stories they told about them. Even if we don't have access to the ceremonies and the rituals as is only right, that's something for these communities. We can learn to be respectful of this and responsive to it in our own thinking. This is a testimony of an Indigenous elder from Australia who speaks of something that many of us, I think, have become familiar with, the idea of dreaming place. He says, our story is in the land. It is written in those sacred places. My children will look after these places. That's the law. Dreaming place. You can't change it no matter who you are. No matter you rich man, no matter you king. You can't change it. Rock stays, earth stays. I die and put my bones in cave or earth. Soon my bones become earth, all the same. My spirit has gone back to my country, my mother. For myself, I read this and I feel simultaneously a sense of recognition, and if I'm being honest, a little bit of distance. This is not my culture. This is not how I was taught to be in the world. And yet it's very moving to hear this testimony and to be reminded of this kind of intimacy that's possible for human beings in this world. And then there's the story of loss of place loss. It's a funny way to express it, but I think we probably intuitively recognize when someone says this. You have an experience of place loss. Either you yourself have been exiled from a place for whatever complicated reasons, or the place itself that was once dear to you and to others is no longer, because of development or many reasons this happens. And then sometimes we know this, uh, culturally, we kind of, I know in North America, a lot of times we just have this unwavering commitment to development and progress. And well, if it means breaking a few eggs, so be it. And I doubt that anybody on this webinar feels that way, but you know that this is part of the story that we're dealing with. Place after place after place, plowed under, destroyed, whatever stories were part of that place, lost to us, and so forth. So Anne Michaels is a Canadian writer who I admire very much, and this novel of hers, The Winter Vault, captures the story of what happened when a great damming project was created in Canada that was going to result in the flooding of many millions of acres. And the engineers' somewhat cavalier attitude toward uh, people having to move away, and not only people having to move away, but having to move graves from the land that was soon to be flooded. And one of the characters in the novel is having a dialogue with one of the engineers who's working on this giant hydrological project. And this is what she says to him as he is narrating, telling her his sense that, well, we're going to move all those graves, so you don't have to worry. And she says, if you move the body, then you'll have to move the hill. You'll have to move the fields around him. This is her husband. You'll have to move the view from the top of the hill and the trees he planted, one for each of our 6 children. You'll have to move the sun because it sets behind those trees. Sorry, it sets among those trees, and move his mother and his father and his younger sister. She was the most admired girl in the county, but all the men died in the first war, so she never married and was laid to rest next to her mother. They're all company for one another, and those graves are old, so you'll have to move the earth with them to make sure nothing of anyone is left behind. Can you promise me that? I think probably most of us could tell a story of some moving that's happened that was done too carelessly and without thought about what had transpired in that place and what was sacred in that place. And we repeat this over and over. And yet we have reminders. This is a reminder. It's one of many that if we don't take care, we're going to lose something absolutely essential to our lives and to the world. So the art of placemaking, our subject for today. What will it mean for us to cultivate as an intentional practice a deeper sense of place? Also to acknowledge the loss of place that is woven into our lives, and to create a new vision of place as sacred, to recover a sense of sacred place. And this is where it's interesting and helpful to think about what it might mean to practice the art of placemaking. And what will it mean for us to think of placemaking as a spiritual practice, as something that belongs in our spiritual vocabulary as part of our work of reparation, a healing work? So this will be very familiar to everyone in this meeting. I hesitate to even repeat it, but actually, in the spirit of monastic meditatio and ruminatio, it's good to turn these things over again and again and to come back to them. One of the root teachings of the desert tradition is to sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything. This this sense that not running around the place constantly, but sitting and listening in this place and no other can bring us something that nothing else can. An awareness of ourselves, of God, of the world around us, of our community. So that sense of sitting in your cell. The later tradition, that's from the Apothegmata Patrum, the later tradition, that will eventually yield the Camaldolese charism. St. Romuald says, sit in your cell as in paradise. Put the whole world behind you and forget it. That sounds very unsympathetic to to environmental concerns, but I think we can situate that in a context of a monastic spirituality of not hating the world, but situating the world in a particular way. Watch your thoughts like a good fisherman watching for fish. The path you must follow is in the Psalms. Never leave it. Above all, realize that you are in God's presence. Sit in your cell as in paradise. there's something amazing to me in the monastic tradition as it relates to placemaking. Um, the monks were not naive about what often did happen if you entered your cell and faced yourself. It could be quite an ordeal, and the iconography of the demons coming out of these solitary places is a one reminder of that. You go into solitude and you often find yourself entering into a great struggle with yourself, with the pain of the world, with your own unhealed wounds. It's deeply, deeply challenging. And St. Romuald do that. And yet he reminds us that the cell can also be a kind of paradise, a place where we come home to ourselves. And so maybe if we think about this as a dimension of, part of the monastic wisdom, uh, to commit ourselves to place, well, there's struggle there. And there's also a deep blessing in coming home to ourselves in this particular place and no other. And we also begin to see, if we think about place and what it is to us, and including the cell, the monastic cell, a little room, a cave. Originally it was that, but as the tradition unfolds, it's in more aromatical expressions of monasticism, it's gonna be a little space set apart. In the more Cenobitic traditions, it'll be a little room among other rooms with your brothers or sisters. And yet there are also other kinds of cells. And I remember encountering this um, reflection of Nelson Mandela and feeling moved by his sense of what came to him in his own long practice of entering his cell. He said, "Bless you, prison. Bless you for being in my life. I came to realize that the cell is an ideal place to learn how to know yourself, to search realistically and regularly the process of your mind and feelings, the opportunity to look daily into your entire conduct." His writings on his time at Robben Island are really powerful and compelling, and he's not making a virtue out of his imprisonment in the sense of condoning those who put him there, or the horrible reality of apartheid, not at all. But he did experience something that he felt gave him a gift that he carried with him the rest of his life, a profound gift that came to him in that great reduction of circumstances in his own cell. Many years ago, I visited, well, when I was much younger, I lived in the Philippines for a year, but maybe 10 years ago, I returned to Manila. I was invited to come there and do some work with a group of men and women religious. And while I was there, I met these two wonderful women, followers of Charles de Foucault, Little Sisters of Jesus. And those of you who know about Charles de Foucault and his particular understanding of desert practice know that his own tradition ended up unfolding largely in the form of men and women living in urban spaces and creating a kind of desert in the city among the poorest of the poor. And these two women invited me to come to their place in the heart of Manila, and it was a it was a neighborhood of just the most fragile and precarious habitations, uh, patched together with whatever material was at hand, and corrugated tin roofs and all the rest of it. And I mean, Manila is a beautiful city with a vibrant culture, and it also has really abysmal poverty. And the sisters live right in the heart of that, and they've created their own little cell in the midst of it, a refuge, just a little desert cell in the midst of the city. And it was very moving to see the desert practice they were living in the heart of Manila, and their own commitment to those with whom they were living. And it's another reminder of how incredibly fluid the monastic tradition is in its imaginative reach. It sometimes yields a way of living that is recognizably monastic, in the way the Benedictines and Cistercians came to live, but it also peels off in unexpected directions, like it does in the case of the followers of Charles de Foucault. And Thomas Merton, well known to everyone, I know, late in his life, he visited Asia. It was his final journey. He died in Asia, and his Asian journal is really extraordinary in opening up what he begins to see as the heart of his own monastic vocation. He's been coming to this for a long time, this kind of weaving together in his own life, in his own sensibility, the contemplative and the active, even though he chose a contemplative way of life. And he kept thinking about it, kept thinking about it. And in Asia, he came to this kind of realization that was, for him, very important about how the contemplative is always overflowing its cup into an embrace of the world. And he's reading of an important Asian philosopher, Sautideva. What impresses me most at this reading of Sautideva, Merton says, is not only the emphasis on solitude, but the idea of solitude as part of the clarification, which includes living for others, dissolution of the self in belonging to everyone, and regarding everyone's suffering as one's own. To be homeless is to abandon one's attachment to a particular ego, and yet to care for one's own life in the highest sense, in the service of others. A deep and beautiful idea. There was an idea in early monasticism, well, we saw it in St. Romuald's comment a little bit earlier, fuga mundi, or contemptus mundi. These are these are terms that don't land easily with us these days, as we're trying to embrace the world as beautiful in the spirit of the incarnation. And Laudato Si's great call to care for the world as our own home. And here is Thomas Merton kind of working out this mystery, how to simultaneously dive deep into solitude, into the work of the cell, and to recognize that that work is always calling you back out into an embrace of others. And he doesn't reference the natural world here, but the implication is clear. The work of solitude and the work of clarification that happens there makes us more available to everyone and everything. It's an inclusive, encompassing vision of spiritual practice. And I think it's very much in sync with this idea of contemplative ecology. We engage in spiritual practice not only to feed ourselves, although we do it, hopefully to be nourished by our practice, but so that we can become more whole and open and receptive and responsive to everyone and everything. This is the chapel at Redwoods, by the way, this image that you're looking at here. So we come back to something that also eludes us. I'll speak for myself. Certainly, it eludes me more often than I wish it did, which is just a simple apprehension of the present moment, which is from the very beginning of the monastic tradition has always been critical to the life of prayer. There are many things you can say about contemplative prayer, but at the heart of it, it's being present to yourself, to God, the larger reality in which you're set down. And this is a little saying from the life of Anthony, Athanasius's great work on the well, in mythical terms anyway, the first Christian monk. He says, Anthony observed that in saying today, he was not counting the time past, but as one always establishing a beginning. He endeavored each day to present himself as the sort of person ready to appear before God, that is, pure of heart and prepared to obey his will and no other. As one always establishing a beginning, each moment precious and full of possibility and meaning. That day by Lake Geneva with the poet and her mother looking up and seeing this column of water coming toward them. Nothing else exists in that moment but that reality. This is what we're invited into again and again in our contemplative practice, is to be reborn with this capacity to be open to the present moment. So I think I'll just go a few more minutes with some thoughts that come less from the monastic tradition than from the tradition of contemporary writing and thought about placemaking and what it is, what it can be. So Keith Basso, an anthropologist who worked for many years with the Western Apache people in Arizona, and who wrote this really remarkable book, Wisdom Sits in Places. The title itself, I remember when I first discovered it, and you do this sometimes when you find a book that speaks to you. Wait a minute, wisdom sits in places. Interesting. What the heck does that mean? And I intuitively you see it, but then like, what is that? What truth is that speaking to? And the entire book is a reflection on what he learned from the Western Apache people about their own relationship to places and to placemaking, and how he came to see that the deep and abiding wisdom of their culture always arose from places that they cherished. Wisdom sits in places. And Basso says what people make of their places is closely connected to what they make of themselves as members of society and inhabitants of the earth. We are, in a sense, the place worlds we imagine. We are, in a sense, the place worlds we imagine. Place world is a kind of an interesting neologism here. If you pause to think about, your own place world, if you want to try that idea on, it could draw you into reflection on maybe all the places you've lived in your life, or the places that have shaped you, and not just the places in terms of geography and the ecological reality of those places, but the history, the culture, the stories. And then you could begin reflecting on how sojourning in this place or that place shaped you and shaped your imagination, your sensibility. Places can also, by the way, wound us. It's worth pausing over that and recognizing that sometimes the places that we've inhabited have not nourished us, but have wounded us. Maybe not the places themselves, but what happened there. So it's worth holding that in our consciousness as well. But here, Basso is making this very interesting connection between place and identity. What people make of their places is closely connected to what they make of themselves as members of society and inhabitants of the earth. We are, in a sense, the place worlds we imagine. So just hold that thought for a moment, but I invite you to consider for yourself whether that rings true for you. And this, I think, when I read it, really caught my attention, because this is where I began to feel like, wait a minute, like this is contemplative. This is contemplative work, And Basso's not pretending to speak for any particular faith tradition or anything like that, but he's trying to give honest expression to what he heard from his Western Apache interlocutors. And this image, by the way, I mean, I will comment on some of these. I'm at my daughter's house at the moment in Santa Rosa, California. I was just up at Redwoods, and I'm on my way home to Los Angeles. So when I looked at the calendar and saw July 13th coming up, I I told Jason I have to think about, well, where can I pause for a moment and meet with all of you? And this is where it is. She was recently married, and I'm here visiting her and her husband. But this is a photograph of the two of us in the Eastern Sierras. We had just crossed through Yosemite Valley. It was many years ago. I had picked her up from college, and I was taking her home, but I took her the long way home, across the Sierras and then down the Owens Valley. And this is probably at about 10,000 feet up in this beautiful meadow. And there were hot springs nearby that we found and plunged ourselves into. And it was getting to be late in the day and sunset. And I looked up, and there were our shadows being cast across the plain. So I took this photograph, but this moment and this place have precious meaning to me for reasons that I probably don't have to explain anymore. But that's what the image is. So here's Basso, the idea of placemaking as having a contemplative character. Places, he says, possess a marked capacity for triggering acts of self-reflection, inspiring thoughts about who one presently is, or memories of who one used to be, or musings on who one might become. And that is not all. Place-based thoughts about the self lead commonly to the thoughts of other things, other places, other people, other times, whole networks of associations that ramify unaccountably within the expanding spheres of awareness that they themselves engender. If you think about, I think Basso is saying, if you give yourself a little time to reflect on the places that have shaped you, it's like pulling on a thread. So many things come tumbling out of that reflection. Who was there with you? Who you were in that time in your life? What happened to you there? If you pursue it further, what was going on in your community? Maybe why you left? Um, who was left behind? It opens up a very rich space for reflection, he's saying. And I think this is not unlike what we see in the monastic tradition when uh, when our monastic teachers invite us to practice meditatio or ruminatio. Um, yes, there is an orientation toward contemplative prayer, certainly in the earliest desert tradition, and later that is oriented toward ever greater clarity and simplicity of thought. It's not that you're supposed to enter the space of prayer and be thinking about a million different things, but there can be moments that are very fruitful in which elements of your own experience come tumbling out of that space of silence. And sometimes these are things that you need to attend to and that still have something to teach you. So, what would it mean for each of us to consider placemaking as a contemplative practice? That's maybe the main question of today. Um, I'm going to go a couple more minutes, and then I'm going to, Teresa, I might ask for your help. It might be fruitful if you found breakout rooms to be helpful. We might do that for 10 minutes or 15 minutes and then come back, or you can guide me in that. I'm also happy just to open it up. Um, so these just a couple more thoughts about listening to the voices of those in our midst, monastic teachers, also other teachers who are helping us think about these questions in a very fruitful way, I think. Leslie Marmon Silko, wonderful Indigenous writer, her book Ceremony remains for me one of the great books of my life that I return to again and again, not least because of its wholehearted attention to rediscovering a sense of place amidst loss and woundedness. She's very courageous in attending to that question. And she's also thinking all the way through uh, this novel about the power of stories that they also can restore us to our places if we can re-inhabit these stories, the stories of place. She says, I will tell you something about stories. They aren't just entertainment. They are all we have to fight off illness and death. You don't have anything if you don't have stories. So what stories of place do we have? What stories do we need to listen to and maybe retell for our own sake, but also for the sake of others who might be healed and blessed by those stories? I think that's part of what Soko is getting at. And maybe I'll just finish with another, uh, writer who's had a lot of impact on my thought, Wallace Stegner, a wonderful Western writer who's written novels, short stories, almost all of which have a really profound sense of place woven into them. The characters are important. The what's happening to them is important. Their feelings are important, but he gives room for the places. He gives the places dignity and standing. we have a little bit of we have a little self-centeredness sometimes when it comes to our stories, our human stories. That's the main thing. And what we see in a lot of these writers is a recentering of the world as the very fundament out of which our stories arise, and reclaiming that. And Stegner says, no place is a place until things that have happened in it are remembered in history, ballads, yarns, legends, or monuments. No place is a place. That's a very funny turn of phrase. No place is a place. What do you mean? Okay, so he's pausing to think about the difference between place as some kind of inert point on a map and something that's alive in us and alive in the world. No place is a place until things that have happened in it are remembered in history, ballads, yarns, legends, or monuments. So I think it would be interesting if it seems like a good idea, and I will ask for your help, Teresa, with this. In my experience, it helps in doing this kind of work of placemaking to start with the particularity of place, to think about the place that you're from or the places that you're from that have shaped you. And it might be worth taking a few minutes to talk in small groups of 2 or 3. Yes, anything that's come up for you as you've been following this morning, but also maybe saying something about the particularity of your place and what kind of story you would tell about it if you had the space to do so, and why you would tell that story. And it's helpful thing, I think, to think about these things and then to think together with others about the places that we cherish and what the work of placemaking looks like for each of us.
I was just exploring the screen. I didn't really have a comment to make at this time. Just trying to get oriented. One of the questions that I had, though, I took notes as you were talking about some of these authors and books, but will you be providing a printed list of that information?
I can, or I can share the PowerPoint with Teresa and Jason, if that's helpful. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I can't always read my writing after I've scribbled.
No, of course. I understand. I'm happy to share that. Yes.
Thank you.
So fire away. Anybody who's ready to jump in? Yeah, raise your hand and jump. Yeah.
Sure.
Well, one of the things that our group discussed was what's happening to our environment, to our sense of place when people come in and build these homes, vacation homes, and they use them maybe a few weeks out of the year and they sit empty, and it drives up property taxes. It creates problems for all the infrastructure. And they just seem to be so oblivious, while those of us who are living in that place are so impacted by them, and even sometimes to the point of destroying family homes, where people have to leave their homes because they can't afford the increased property taxes and things, and have to move on to someplace else. And it just seems like such a gross injustice in this day and age. Damage to the place.
Well, you've stated it very clearly. I'm not sure I have more to add to that, except that I agree with you.
Let's see, Judith, I think you had your hand up. If you unmute. There we go.
It's helped me a lot. Your talk has helped me a lot in appreciating how I go back in my memories of places that I've lived in a lot of different places. And it's always been nature that has drawn me to these places, what was in these places that I could explore. And I always used to think, well, you got to quit going back, you got to quit going back. Just be here now. But I realized that the memories are good. They're good things, and they bring me pleasure and joy and um and a lot of positive feelings. So you've made me realize that I can go to those places, memories, places, and enjoy them again, and remember the places that I explored and the people I met and that sort of thing. So thank you for that.
Well, I appreciate that. And I mean, first of all, it's wonderful that you feel like, hey, it's not such a bad thing to, be in the space of those memories. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's incredibly important, on its own terms. Just it's
Mm-hmm.
part of your own life narrative and
Yeah.
experience. And I would also say that I think, uh, getting in the habit of that kind of reflection can also enhance our experience at the present moment and the places where we're making places now.
Mm-hmm.
They can be related to each other, and you start to feel the weave of the whole flow of it. So
Mm-hmm.
the past can help us go deeper into the present. I'm convinced of that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the development of sense of place over the lifespan, like as we age, and whether or not that has an impact on how we find a sense of place.
Oh, that's a great question. Um, well, uh, I don't think it's bad to put your cards on the table every once in a while. I just turned 70. So I'm like, oh my goodness gracious. These big markers that come your way. I know some of you maybe on the call will think, oh, you're just a pup. You don't know anything. 70, that's young. Anyway, it's all relative. Um, I have been thinking about that a lot, actually. There's I've encountered quite a bit of writing and thinking about the idea of nostalgia. And sometimes when we hear the word nostalgia, it feels like, well, you know, our feeling for the good old days, and it can have that meaning, but it often has a much deeper meaning. The root etymology of it is something like, return pain, return pain, and it gets at this feeling, a bittersweetness sometimes that comes when we re-engage our own past places, past experiences, partly because that past is now apart from our memory. It's lost to us. It's gone. And in part because of that, some of us feel habituated to not go there too much because it's painful, or just the reality of how much of our life has passed. And but I think there's something very creative that can come of doing this work of reflection over time, and it gets to be in some ways more powerful with the passing of time. Experience has this cumulative power, and there's more of your past to reflect on. Now, I'll just speak for myself. I find that sometimes daunting. How am I supposed to incorporate all this into my current consciousness and life? And but I also know there's a danger in cutting ourselves off from the past or pretending that it didn't matter. And so I think there is, I think there's a lot of benefit to be found in rehearsing our own salvation history, which includes earlier moments of places and moments in time that in some ways are lost to us, but in other ways are not. And that, it's not like we're meant to just reflect on everything that ever happened to us and try to kind of gather it into our, we would probably explode if we did that. But where are those places in our experience of our past life that are still calling to us or trying to get our attention? We have them. I think we all have them. And sometimes it's rooted in regret, something that we never quite resolved. Sometimes it's a deep joy that we've forgotten to cherish, and so then there's a chance to cherish it anew. And I think people who, I'm saying things, some of what I'm saying today, of course, these are things that I aspire to and that I occasionally actually experience. I don't want to hold myself out as a model of anything, but people who learn to cherish their experience, including past experience, I think often become good at cherishing every new experience. It's infectious. So I think there's a lot to be gained from gathering in the threads. And then sometimes there's things that you need to let go of as well. That's also true. But yeah, those are some of my thoughts about it. Yeah.
See, maybe one more question or comment. Yeah, Judith, just unmute.
I appreciate what you were just saying about the past, thinking about the past and having some things that you regret and just want to push them aside. And I've, over the past few years, those things have been coming back and I've been thinking about them. And it's what you said, they're part of our salvation. It's a part of our plan of life that, I guess it's something that we're supposed to work out, how we work out our lives and our salvation. And so I don't beat myself up so much anymore. I accept them as part of me and part of my path, which is so relieving. It's just so engulfing with the love of God, because the
Yes.
love of God is who told me this, who shares this with me, enlightened me with this knowledge. And I'm
Yes.
77. And when you were talking about traveling around in California, it brought back a lot of memories from my, earlier years. I wasn't in California that much, but just I met a lot of people up here in Idaho at Sun Valley that were from California, and just reading a lot of the stories. So I really enjoyed everything you've shared.
Thank you. Thank you for what you just shared too.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's wisdom in that. Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, well, I think it's time. So Douglas, what an amazing experience of sharing with you, of learning from your wisdom, the chance for all of us to share our own. And I think we will all go away with a much deeper sense of place, of its gift, of what it has to teach us, and hopefully how we can share that with the broader world. And on behalf of the Center for Benedictine Life, we invite you to come up here and
Yes.
experience our beautiful place in the Benedictine tradition. So thank you again. And we will see everybody next month. And our very own Sister Carol Ann will wrap up our series. So
Yes.
thank you and
Thank you.
have a great rest of the day.